It was at this point that I was starting to get a bit nervous with my combat system. My game is supposed to be a cross between Zelda and Pokemon, and neither of those parts were working. If I couldn't design a combat system that realized the vision of capturing creatures and using their abilities, then was this game even worth finishing? On top of that, I was planning on running a Kickstarter for the game, so if I wasn't able to make it work, should I just cancel it? When I started developing Synth Beasts 1.5 years ago, everything seemed to click into place super easily except for one thing, and that was the combat. After struggling with the design on and off for about a year, I finally fixed it a few months ago, and in this video I'll show you the exact 4 issues that the game's combat design had, and the 4 solutions that I implemented to fix each of these issues. So let me explain how the original version of the combat system worked. Basically, the game had monsters that you can catch and use, and every monster had an ability. For example, this is the monster that you start off with, and its ability is super simple, it's just a melee attack. But then, if you catch this little guy, you get access to a ranged attack with a fireball. Or if you catch this one, you can use it to jump over obstacles, but it also is very useful in combat because the jump dodges enemy attacks. And when it lands, it also deals a good amount of damage. So everything seems pretty good so far, right? Wrong. On paper, it seems like this would be fun, but as I explained a few moments ago, there are 4 issues that this specific design had, so let me tell you the first one, and how I solved it. The first issue was that while the different monsters had different use cases, the starting monster with the melee attack was just straight up better than any other option in most situations. So, how did I fix this? Well, in Pokemon, your monsters level up, right? Synth Beast at the time didn't have this at all, but I thought that maybe if each monster had its own leveling with really cool rewards upon leveling up, then players would be incentivized to play as different monsters in combat situations, just to see, what rewards there are on leveling up every single individual monster. So I implemented this, and it really worked, and it really felt like there was actually a point to using different monsters other than the first one. But there were still 2 problems. Granted, they were much smaller and much easier to fix, but absolutely necessary to make this progression system work. The first one was that because each level took the same amount of EXP to level up, there was no real reason to swap between the monsters until you had maxed out your current one. So that was an easy fix. I just made the EXP curve really steep, so lower leveled monsters level up faster, and so players are incentivized to use those. Then, the second issue that arose from the solution of implementing the progression system was that having small incremental stat increases like Pokemon on leveling up was just not enticing enough to get players to try out the new monsters. Like if one monster gets more HP on level up or another one gets more damage, it's just not different enough to entice them. So the fix to this is something that I've not really seen in any other games before, but it was making each level incredibly impactful and then having fewer levels that you can obtain in total per monster. In the end, this felt super cool, and now some of the monsters that were previously kind of boring really got the chance to shine. Like, for example, the jumping guy that I showed before, while it had its use cases, it wasn't super interesting, right? The jumping attack was useful for certain combat scenarios, but because it's necessarily slow because it needs to be used for puzzles, it wasn't most players' go-to. But now, as you level it up, it gets really cool bonuses like shooting projectiles on landing, so that was solved. But as I realized that the combat became more complex, the healing system actually wasn't holding up, so that was the second core issue that I talked about at the beginning of the video. So originally you would find apples when breaking some of the destructible level elements, and these would heal a bit of HP. And while this worked alright, it was a bit frustrating when you were in an intense combat situation and then there were just no apples around to pick up, so you couldn't heal. So what I did was I took a page out of Hollow Knight and took inspiration from their healing system, but I tweaked it a bit to work better with Synth Beast strengths. In Hollow Knight, you can get soul from hitting enemies, which is a resource that allows you to heal and use special attacks. And the new addition that I made to Synth Beasts is something very similar, which I called Juice. You get Juice when you hit enemies, just like Hollow Knight, and you can have multiple Juice notches, just like Hollow Knight, and you also hold down the button to use Juice to heal, like Hollow Knight, so it seems pretty similar to that game, right? Well, the key differentiator between both of these systems is that I designed mine to work with the main mechanic of the game, which is swapping between creatures. So if you're low on health, you could just tough it out and hope that you get enough juice from hitting the enemies that you're battling at the moment. But what you could do instead, that could heal you much faster, is swap to this character, and what it does is that it deals very little damage, has very low attack range, but juice replenishes ultra fast if you manage to hit with it. So this adds a bit more push and pull to the combat, and it's actually kind of inspired by how the modern Doom games do resource management. In those games, when you're low on health, you can do a special melee attack called a glory kill that puts you at risk because you have to get super close to the enemy, but if you do pull it off, you get healed. So in a way, Synth Beast is taking equal inspiration from both Hollow Knight and Doom, but unlike both of those games, I still felt that the enemies in Synth Beast were quite basic, so that was the third issue. And just to illustrate my point, let me show you some enemies so that you can maybe see if there's a pattern between all of these, okay? For example, you have this enemy with a generic ranged attack. Then you had your classic chaser glass cannon. There were also some melee enemies. And all these worked fine when you fought them one-on-one or two-on-one, but they really didn't feel interesting enough when putting them together in a combat arena. And that worked fine for the beginning of the game where the combat isn't super complex, but clearly what I had to do is create more interesting enemies for these kinds of situations later on. And so out of all the new ones that I made, the one I'm most happy with is this little guy over here. What it does is that it has a short attack range, but it dashes whenever it attacks, so if you don't keep your distance, it can be super dangerous. It also applies poison, and of course, you can use that ability yourself when you capture it, so that adds a layer of complexity to the game with level ups and items that I'll go over in a video in the future, so subscribe if that interests you. So given that this enemy is a threat up close, it forces you to use ranged attacks, which I felt were not as strong as melee attacks with the other early enemies. Then, there's this enemy which does the exact opposite and it incentivizes melee attacks. This one stays still for a while and then leaps at you, but the catch is that it doesn't take any knockback. So pushing it back with ranged attacks from a distance doesn't work super well, and so you have to time your dodges and attack it once it's landed. Combining all of these enemies together now works super well and it's super fun to play, and because of this, I've been adding more and more of these combat areas to certain areas of the game. How they work is that there are waves of enemies that appear, and once you defeat them all, you usually get a reward or something like that. So now that the game has a wider variety of enemies, these can be way more interesting. So on screen right now, you'll see an example of how these wave combats used to look like. So kind of just dashing between enemies and doing your thing. But one of the more recent ones that I implemented is this one. And so you can see there's a huge difference, but there was still one issue with the combat, and that was that there weren't really any true one-on-one tests of skill. Everything worked well for group combat, but not one-on-one combat. So that was the fourth issue that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and that's where the addition of bosses come in. Originally, the game did have bosses, but they were limited to just at the end of dungeons, and were quite basic to be honest. Like the one that you see here on screen is the first boss, and all you do is attack it from afar while dealing with the enemies that it spawns. And it works well enough for the beginning, it's the first boss, but the combat system is so layered now that I felt that the game could do better. So what I did was I added bosses to areas other than the end of dungeons, and they really added so much to the game. Like, this is one of the optional bosses, for instance, and it has you dodge fire projectiles while trying to handle its dash attack. This one here is also a really cool one that teleports around the screen, but is vulnerable both when it shoots and when it spawns these little floor cracks that damage you. Overall, while I am really happy with these, and there are some more bosses that I'll show in future videos, so of course, subscribe for those, I still do feel like the bosses tend a bit too much towards rewarding ranged attacks. So for the next few ones that I make, I'm trying to figure out how to reward more melee attacks with the combat system that I've designed so far. So the combat system, and by extension the game itself, is in a far better state than it was before, and I feel like it's the best work I've ever done in terms of making moment-to-moment gameplay fun. And one thing that I haven't mentioned yet in this video is that I'm going to allow some players to design their own bosses, create their own playable monsters, and build their own islands, and the way in which I'm going to do that is through doing a Kickstarter, and it's going to be running next month. So if that interests you and you want to be part of the game's development, make sure to follow the Kickstarter link in the description, and I'll see you all for the next video. So until next time, bye.